even though I've played, I have a different experience and perspective than what AGU might see. And we need to aggregate those to get a full picture of what this player is. You can get in trouble when you think you know it all. Like, especially coming from an NBA background, like, I've been in the league 5 years. How are you going to tell me about basketball? Or how are you going to say that that's a good player or not? And that wasn't so difficult to get through, but as you go draft by draft by draft, you start to realize what misses you have. And you're like, I could have swore that dude was going to be legit. And time's still ticking with him, but you learn pretty quickly who fits and who doesn't. And so you have to kind of train your eye to project college players into the NBA, because there's phenomenal college players that are they just don't make it in the NBA. It's two different games, and there's things that work in the NBA that just don't work in college.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Vet Moves podcast, where you get courtside seats to the shortcuts you can only learn through experience. I'm your host, Anthony Goods, and I think this is starting to turn into a Stanford podcast, man. I keep having all these ex-Stanford gentlemen on, but we got a very, very special guest today, man, a guy that I had the pleasure of hosting and, inviting into Stanford. And, we lined up against each other plenty of times, but by far he's one of the most skilled teammates I've ever played with. Went on to have a 5-year career in the NBA, and now he's transitioned over into the NBA front office at the tender age of 33. Please give a nice Vet Moves welcome to my man Landry Fields. Landry, what's good, bro?
What's good? Buenos? I don't know. Can I call you Buenos? Is that all right? That's still the nickname
Hey,
from back
yeah,
in the
nah,
day.
it's all good. It's
All right.
this
I don't know
is
how
a
formal
family
this was.
affair. Nah,
Perfect.
man, we chilling, man. So, nah, it's super dope to have you on, man. And
Thanks for having me.
it's fun. It's funny, man. I've always been like a fan of your game. Even when we were at Stanford, man, I really loved your game and the fact that you were so skilled and you were able to score in so many different ways. You know what I'm saying? And I think
Cool.
that was definitely one of your strong suits, man. Even moving into the NBA, man. But you were, we used to call you Skills back in the day, and that was rightfully so.
I haven't heard that in a while. No, I appreciate that. I was actually thinking back even before this call. I was like, what are my earliest memories of AG? And the first time was like in high school when I saw you. We were at some tournament at, I want to say it was like Azusa Pacific or something like that. And you were balling, and somebody's like, yeah, that dude's going to Stanford. And I was like, I want to go to Stanford too. But nobody was recruiting me at that point in time. But then we got on campus that summer before, and I remember Dub, Carlton Weatherby, for the people that don't know who he is, he had mentioned something similar because I was just back cutting all day and he was finding me and whatnot. But then he's like, but you got to guard AG. And I'm like, all right, here we go. And your ass, well, I don't know if I cuss out here, you
You good?
were so strong and so quick. I was like, oh, this world is going to be a lot different than what it was in high school. So I appreciate not only the hosting of getting me there, but my introduction into basketball at Stanford. That was a wake-up call. Thanks.
Yeah, nah, we definitely had some good times there, man. But we all grown up now, so
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
we go.
real grown.
We got the beards and everything else going
Yeah,
on
we
right
were
now.
little
So
then. That was it.
yeah, we all grew up now, but yeah, man. So obviously, the premise of this podcast is to kind of shed some light on how athletes transition into their next careers, their second life. And obviously, you've had a nice and a quick path up into the front office, where you're the assistant GM of the Atlanta Hawks now. But let's take it back though. So let's take it back to your rookie year as a player, and we'll also go to your rookie year stepping into as a scout. What is a vet move you would have given yourself as a rookie player and as a scout when you first decided to retire?
So as a player, something on court, and then I'll go off court. On court, you see it now a lot. Guys are so much smarter, and that foul before the bonus, you see Trae Young do it a lot. You see Chris Paul do it a lot. KD does it a lot. That like swipe to get to the free throw line, it's just such a crucial point in time. And the way refs are calling fouls now, guys have had to be even more crafty in terms of getting to the line, especially the guys where a lot of their scoring ends up coming from the free throw line because they had that rule change with how guys are going to get fouled. And, it's being in the Hawks, it has specifically impacted Trey. But just that craftiness and thinking the game like that when I was a rookie would have been just great. I think it would have allowed me a few more points a game, and it wouldn't have just made me the perimeter shooter that I was in D'Antoni's system early on. But then some off the court, which would have been great, was actually finding somebody outside of the organization that could be a sort of like life coach and somebody that I could have mentor me and feed me, wisdom and guidance and somebody that I would ultimately respect but feel vulnerable with and share some of the experiences I was going through because that rookie year, as well as I think I did and as quick as I found myself in sort of the success of New York, it was a lot to deal with. Just the grind of the season, expectations, just New York in general. And I didn't really have an outlet, so I kind of became a recluse at that point in time. And when you're left to your own thoughts and devices, it start to go crazy. So I would tell my former self that you need to find somebody that's beyond you to kind of help you out with that lifestyle. So that's on the court, but getting or on the court, off the court, when I was playing. But now being in a front office role, things I wish I would have done as a rookie is it was quite a wake up call when you go from an NBA lifestyle of hotels and travel to scouting life, where it's all going to depend on your team's budget, but there's no more Four Seasons and Ritz-Carltons and all this stuff you get spoiled when you play. No more first class at that point in time until you actually earn enough miles to get that medallion status. But even then, you got to make sure there's an open seat. So just tapering expectations for that whole lifestyle was something early on, which it wasn't a great deal to me, but it was something where I was like, I can see where a lot of players come to this and like, yeah, this ain't for me. This ain't for me. So you're on the grind there at a completely different way than you are in the NBA.
Yeah, I can imagine, man. And going back to your point about having that life coach, especially off the court, I think just as young players, I feel like we're so hesitant to ask for help. Like we feel like, okay, let me just focus on basketball. And if basketball is going well, then I should be fine. I shouldn't need help, elsewhere. And especially like you being in a big market in New York, first team, all rookie. There's just a lot of things that are being thrown at you overnight. When you come
Yeah.
from Stanford, and it wasn't like Stanford's a big market college team or anything like that. So,
Yeah.
so much changes overnight. Like I feel like young players are kind of ignorant to think that like, oh, okay, I can just figure this out on the way, and it's just obviously you just don't know. But I think that's a super dope piece of advice, man, for any young player.
For sure. Like that's something even as I tell our young guys coming into this organization now is to get used to the idea that there are things that you don't know and to have that humility of or that posture of coachability and teachability because the basic premise is like what got you here is not going to get you there. So everything that you thought was like working for you to get you drafted, I promise you, you want to be an all-star, you want to be all NBA, any of these other things that you have a vision for, you're going to have to change course. You're going to have to pivot a little bit. And the best way to do that is to find somebody that you can dialogue with and allow them to speak into where you ultimately want to go. And usually you got to find somebody that's probably been there before. So if you want to be an all-star, I would knock on every vet's door just be like, you need to teach me and download all your information to my system so that I can ultimately get there. And it takes a lot, to your point. Like, yeah, it's either ignorance or sort of a lack of humility, or you have this sort of invincibility cloak on, right? Like, man, I could take on the world. I'm that dude. And what's crazy is like, that's what gets you to where you ultimately are. And
Yeah, you
so
need
I'm
that.
not. Yeah, you need that. You need that ego to get there. Because if you don't have that confidence or that swag, it's like shit. You're not gonna make that. But
Right,
it's
right.
it's a completely different change of pace when you do ultimately get to that checkpoint, as I say. And then if you want to get further than that, but it's a good point. You're right.
Yeah, nah, it's definitely different, man. But what made you decide? So obviously your last years in Toronto, you were struggling with that nerve injury in your elbow, and you decided to retire. So, what made you decide? Okay, I'm gonna go scouting and try to pursue the front office route versus the coaching route. Because I mean, as I said before, I mean, you were so skilled and obviously you're a cerebral individual coming from the Harvard of the West and Stanford, but I think you would have been a great coach as well.
Uh,
You know what I mean? I mean, just the way you think the game and just things of that nature, and being around so many great basketball minds. What made you choose one direction as opposed to the other?
I mean, it's actually a good question because just with my personality and how I approach things, there is a lot of coaching and teaching involved with it, and I just enjoy it. I love learning new things, studying new things, and then passing it on and trying to help somebody on their journey. So coaching would have been like an easy segue into post career, uh, but I think that my last few years in Toronto, I was doing a lot of chilling on the bench. Like I was scouting early on, and I was looking
Okay.
at different players, and I was in my mind wondering like, man, what makes that guy so good at what he does, or where's the value in that player? And I was actually talking with Bobby Webster, who was the assistant GM at the time of Toronto, just sort of some of the background on the front office and what does it mean to scout and how do you approach your work in that day-to-day life. And it was intriguing to me, and I think that the biggest piece that was different was um, there was a strategy with roster construction that was very appealing to me, as opposed to the strategy of trying to put guys in right places for performance, right? And now it overlaps some, but it was that to me, working with a group to figure out, okay, what players work best together, how do you develop culture, and you do this all in coaching, right? It's not that far-fetched or different than being in the front office, but that just seemed to kind of be the pathway for me. And in scouting, there was an early opportunity to scout with the Spurs, which kind of pulled me into that direction more so than an opportunity to get on the floor with players. And early on, like, it was sort of this battle. I didn't know if I wanted to kind of continue on in front office or do some stuff on court. But ultimately, I just found a lot of joy in learning like the CBA and strategizing in that way than trying to break down game film. Even though you do a lot of that in scouting, and just kind of get to the nuances for players.
Right. So when you first dove into scouting, um, was it as easy as you thought it was going to be? Was it harder, or what adjustments did you have to make? You know what I mean? Because it's like we all think we know basketball. Like I know basketball or whatever, but I can imagine like taking that information and delivering it and writing it out and things of that nature is a completely different ball game.
Yeah, yeah. It was. It wasn't as challenging as I thought it would be from the eye test, right? I credit that just to the fact that like we played at high levels, and I find even now when you get so like some of the best scouting reports that I get or when I talk with our players about other players and who they like and who they don't like and why, and you use that with sort of with current scouts that may not have played, and they're both brilliant, but they offer just a different perspective. So like in San Antonio, they were kind of giving me the Spurs way, and like here's what we look for, here are the value systems that we have, and it was like a few minutes in, and they kept asking me like, "Do you have any questions?" Like kind of probing me to see like this is not easy stuff, and I'm like, nah, man, I got it, like I do. Now the adjustment I had to make was I came in with these Mark Twain just scouting reports, like full blown 1,000, 1,500 word documents, and some of the older scouts pull me aside, they're like, look, bro. We don't need all that. Like, it's great, but you're not writing a book. Just give us like, what you don't like, maybe what they do, and your overall gist of it all. So that was an adjustment in trying to, one, from a scouting report standpoint, but also when you work with other scouts, having the mindset that even though I've played, I have a different experience and perspective than what AGU might see. And we need to aggregate those to get a full picture of what this player is. You can get in trouble when you think you know it all. Like, especially coming from an NBA background, like, I've been in the league 5 years. How are you going to tell me about basketball? Or how are you going to say that
Right,
that's a good
right.
player or not? And that wasn't so difficult to get through, but as you go draft by draft by draft, you start to realize what misses you have, and you're like, I could have swore that dude was going to be legit. And time's still ticking with him, but you learn pretty quickly who fits and who doesn't. And so you have to kind of train your eye to project college players into the NBA, because there's phenomenal college players that are just they just don't make it in the NBA. For
Right.
it's two different games, and there's things that work in the NBA that just don't work in college. And so we use the word, does it translate, does it translate, does it translate, and so trying to piece that together with other people's opinions, keep your ego low and down so you can get to the good of that team in that environment. It takes an adjustment. It's not something incredibly difficult, but it is something where if you're not able to get over yourself, you can have some trouble, as it is with any team, right? And we know that from basketball.
Right. And so you were doing that for 3 years, and then you transitioned as the general manager of the Austin Spurs. How did that opportunity come about, and what was that challenge like for you?
So Andy Birdsong was in that role. He's currently the assistant GM of the Brooklyn Nets, and so he was the GM of the Austin Spurs. And I think it was like the spring before, I forgot which draft it was. He let us all know that he was leaving and he was going to take that job. And so that job was open, and the Spurs hadn't filled it. And Brian Wright, who's the current GM of the Spurs, he came to me and he said, we might have some opportunity in Austin for you. We don't know what we're going to do with our personnel yet. And for me, that was very intriguing, because in scouting, I ultimately kind of saw myself as, maybe I can run a team one day, like just kind of be in that seat. And so I'm going to need the experience in order to get there. So when he told me that, I went back to him and I said, hey, I know you're going to figure this out on your own, and you and RC and Pop will talk about where you want different personnel. But if there is real opportunity in Austin, I would love to be, in the mix for consideration. One thing leads to the next, and they're saying, yeah, if you want to do it, this is your chance, but it's going to require you to move. So at the time, I was living in California in LA. So I'd have to move my family to San Antonio, not Austin, San Antonio, because I still had a number of different roles that I was engaged in, apart from just being the GM there. And it was great because it allowed me to stay in San Antonio. Tyler Self, who's the current GM of Austin Spurs, was my assistant GM at the time, and he was just great. He could have ran it back then even without me. But just getting that experience of now, as opposed to just scouting, now you have some authority to change some things around under the umbrella, right, of the Spurs value system, and working with people and working with coaches. And then what's that relationship look like between you and a player when you're not a coach, because you don't want to step on any toes. You want to make sure that you're aligned with the coaches, and that's always an ordeal. So I would always go to the coach and say, hey, I'm going to tell player X this. Is that okay? Is that aligned with what you're saying? Just so they understood that, one, I had their back and wanted to make sure that they knew I wasn't trying to come in with something different, but then also bring a different perspective on the same sort of topic for the player, just in a different experience mode. So it was great to get that upfront experience with players and a staff that you have to manage and coaches that you're managing, and not only basketball stuff, but all the personal life of everyone, and make sure everyone's set up in their rental and their cars are aligned. I mean, like all these things that you don't necessarily think about that are part of the job, and it's not always sexy, but you do have to make sure that you're caring for people, because you want them to feel loved while they're in your organization. So all that was a challenge, just because it was so new to me and I had never done anything like that before.
Yeah, I was always wondering, like, what are some of, and obviously there's a ton of differences, but what are like the main differences between, let's say, a GM of a G League team versus a GM of an NBA team? And I think especially with an NBA team, you have a lot more support and staff and things of that nature. So yeah, as a GM of a G League team, booking booking rental cars and things
Yeah.
like that are things that you would typically think a GM is doing, but at that
Yeah.
level, you kind of have to, right?
You're working with a little smaller budget on things and not quite the same personnel, but you do have the avenues that grow into bigger ones, right? For the NBA team, you still have to work through how you're able to manage a roster, all the day-to-day stuff that I mentioned before. Like it is something that you do have to work through. But it was good. Like that's the schooling that I needed if I ultimately wanted to become a GM in the NBA. I find that as a great training ground for me. And also, as other people are coming up through organizations, it gives me that point of reference and a point of empathy that I can have as they're going through. I'll be like, hey, I can genuinely say, hey, me too. I understand what it's like, and it's not always sexy, but trust me, you're growing in your competence and you're growing in your character if you ultimately want to become who you envision to become. So I find that helpful.
Right. Now, with your rise, up to being an assistant GM, it's been a rather quick rise. I know there was a lot of effort and a lot of hard work behind that. What do you think it is about you personally, and like, what were some of like the extra hours that people don't see that enabled you to rise so quickly, to this position and get to where you are now?
Well, you're absolutely right. Well, let me comment first on this. It takes your own work, right? You can't become what you're going to become without practice. But there's also opportunity that has a lot to do with you, but also nothing to do with you at the same time. So, like, just to kind of go back, like my opportunity with Atlanta was I happened to be on a scouting trip for San Antonio, and I sat next to the owner's son of the Atlanta Hawks. His name's Nick Wrestler, and I was starving. Like sometimes you get on these road trips and you don't eat because you're flying in late and you gotta go straight to the gym. And you got a couple games if you're doing like a Thanksgiving Day trip or that week for Feast Week. So I'm eating chicken tenders and we're watching. I want to say it was Auburn and New Mexico. Like Isaac Okoro was the guy we were watching. And I sat right next to him just by happenstance, and I'm eating, and we're kind of chatting it up, not even about anything deep or whatnot, but just kind of like, yeah, like how's your trips going? All the regular stuff scouts talk about, like where you headed next, where'd you come from, is there
Right.
anybody you like that you can maybe tell me, but not, display what you're trying to do with your organization. So just those conversations, and at the end of it, I had no idea who Nick was. I didn't know who he worked for, and I asked him, I'm like, so who do you work for? He said the Atlanta Hawks. And I was like, oh, how'd you get that job? He's like, well, my family owns the team. I'm like, yeah, okay, that makes total sense. And unbeknownst to me, that was a starting point where whatever I said, and he always says, he's like, I just like the fact that you were eating chicken tenders because I never see scouts eat. And like he's like, and I enjoyed our discussion. And I'm like, oh, cool, like that's great. That was a point of reference that he had where internally the Atlanta Hawks were looking for an assistant GM, and this will segue into your original question, where they wanted a former player in the seat to add that perspective because they didn't have that as a group. And so by just sitting and kind of being myself with him, it added me to a list of individuals that they were talking about and wanting to interview. Then they asked the Spurs for permission to ultimately interview me. And again, kind of like what I was saying, former players' perspective was crucial for what they wanted to do, and just by needs of the Atlanta Hawks, I think what I have to offer may not be relevant for all teams, for what exactly they needed and whatever they found out through the interview process they felt I could provide. And I could guess now a lot of what that is, and sort of the extra hours that you were asking about what people don't see. I think the biggest thing is you can't mistake authority for leadership, and vice versa. Like just because you sit in a seat of authority doesn't necessarily make you a leader. Leadership is like a skill as anything else. Like you're working on the skill of a podcast, you're working on a skill of working on your left hand, shooting, defense. These are all skills that you need to develop in. And so a lot of what I really enjoy doing is leadership training and leadership development, and surrounding myself with mentors and leaders who actually coach that into people. And so when I sit with, I don't know, whoever it is, I'm trying to exercise a lot of emotional intelligence. I'm trying to read the room. I'm trying to give that space, whatever it needs, in order for that person to ultimately win and grow at whatever they're doing. And so that takes skill, and that's some things that I've been working on for years. And I pay a group outside of the Hawks to help me with with that, just so I can bring leadership training to my environment. And I think that was a piece that's been very helpful in my current role here, as I work with players and we work with different staffs, and I work with Travis, who's our president and GM right now, and kind of we work together to kind of help nurture this environment accordingly. So it doesn't hurt to have a former player's perspective, having played, because I can empathize with players and I can get to know them.
Right.
But then also that's sort of the that, if you look at the tip of the iceberg, what's going on underneath that a lot of people don't see.
Right. And last couple questions. So, what was that interview process like? For the assistant GM job, with the Hawks. What were the was there anything that kind of caught you off guard, like heading into it?
Caught me off guard. It was other than the fact that it was in the middle of COVID, so it was all through Zoom. I mean, that was an odd environment, but that's nobody's fault. It's just what you had to do. Nothing caught me off guard. It was a lot of that kind of get to know you, what process I had used along the way in my job, what were some values that I have, and how would those values translate to the values that they were sharing about the Hawks and whatnot. I did a couple rounds of interviews for them, just with different personnel that were in their upper management leadership positions, just to see kind of how I would fit with that group. So there was nothing that was crazy, and I only know a few interview processes. Maybe there's ways other teams do it, but for this one, it was almost similar to kind of like what we're doing right now. Like, they would ask questions, and I'd give my answers, and they put me in hypothetical situations, and I'd say this is how I would handle it, and that's ultimately what it came to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's cool, man. So let's take it, and I like to frame this one in the sense of, let's say we're speaking to an overseas basketball player, right? So let's just say we have an overseas basketball player. He's 1 year away, maybe even 2 years away from knowing that he's about to retire. What's some advice, or what are some things he can do to make that transition a little more seamless into, let's say, scouting or an NBA front office job?
I do a few things. I think the first thing, which is very practical, is to just start doing some scouting now. Like, if you're a year out, just start looking at different films of players and kind of figuring out where your biases are and what really grabs your attention. Because you and I can look at the same film, and you'll see something that I don't, and I'll see something that you won't, and it's usually tied to a value or something that we've experienced, or anything that we consider to be important for a player or an organization. Like, for me, like I love to see great feel and IQ, whereas another person might love to see versatility and athleticism, but you need all of those, right? So it's understanding yourself, having a self-awareness of how you scout and what naturally catches your eye. And if you can bring that to an interview and say, like, this is what's important to me. I know it's not the only thing, but if you want the most of me, here's what you're probably going to get. So just getting yourself adjusted and acclimated to scouting and the breakdown of film, I think is important. You can start that at any point. But if you're going into like an NBA front office, another crucial component is the collective bargaining agreement, and how, let's say you're scouting the pro as opposed to amateur or college or overseas. There's only so many things you can do. There's only certain mechanisms you can use in order to attain certain players. And if you don't understand how to navigate that map, which is the CBA, it's just a little more difficult. Yeah, you minimize your upside when having discussions around who you should bring in and who you shouldn't, because you can say, I want to bring in player X, but he makes this amount of money, but we only have this amount of money to trade that for, so now you create a 3-team trade. I mean, like, if you don't have a working knowledge or a language of that, you're just not ready for the next stage, and that's totally fine. So I would encourage anybody that wants to get into it, if they want to go further than just the scouting for the eye piece, and they want to get into front office management, start learning the CBA as well. Like that is going to be absolutely crucial for that. And then I think finally too, kind of what I touched on, which has been just truly helpful for me, is getting into some leadership training. Because ultimately you're going to have to work with others, and your emotional intelligence is going to have to go through the roof, and you're going to have to make sure that how you're managing people and working with humans, you want to have a good grasp of that. So I'd say those three things are going to be important, and you can do all three of them before you're done playing.
Right. No, that's key advice, man. And like real quick, like what's your day to day responsibilities like, and like in your lifestyle, like in regards to traveling and stuff like that for work? Is it pretty hefty?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on that time of year too. If it's early college season, right? They're doing a bunch of tournaments. There's 4 games in a day, so you'll sit in the gym for 4 to 5 days watching 4 games a day. Like, grab you some coffee. That can be hectic. You're traveling. You want to see which players are sort of projected early on. I like to get a lot of traveling done early in college, and like personally, like I still have my family. I can't just like dime out on my family and be like, yo, I'm out all the time. So I have to really be intentional about how I'm scheduling things, and just the day to day when you're not traveling. Again, it's a lot of breakdown and film. For me specifically, it's keeping kind of a pulse on how things are going here. It's working with Travis and trying to extract from him, like, hey, what do you think about this idea, or how do you want to approach this? Where do you need me most in this particular time? So he may give me some marching orders, or if there's not much going on, it's a lot of check in with staff, check in with players. I think letting them know how much we appreciate them and have their back goes a long way in a business that's very demanding. And in the very next breath, you could say to a player like, yeah, we love you while you're here, but you understand, like, we still need to maneuver through the CBA this way, and we're going to have to trade you, or we're going to have to not resign you, whatever it might be. But I think players always know that. But I do think that while they are here, they want to feel seen, appreciated, and heard. And that's just me putting my former player hat on. Like, what would I want from my front office at that point in time? Because as soon as they walk in the gym, everyone sits up straight. It's just on their best P's and Q's, and like you going a little harder on drills. It's like, don't fake the funk, bro. I can see through the windows what you're doing. But you want to minimize that challenge and stress whenever you're around, so they can operate optimally, right? Like, at the end of the day, basketball is great, but there's a lot of things they're gonna far surpass and transcend this game for all of us, and I think we all want to be intentional about how we're approaching that. So that's pretty typical, and it depends. It's varying. It's a lot of science, but it's a lot of art too. And that's something that I've had to grow in and learn a lot these past years with Atlanta.
I dig it, man. Well, look, man, I appreciate your time, man. You dropped a lot of jewels for us, and
Anytime, man.
this was great, man. So I appreciate it. Best of luck. Best of luck to y'all for the rest of the season. And yeah, I'll be tapping in with you, man. Hey, don't be inviting me to no more open runs. My knees are still cooked from the summer, bro.
Oh
I
man, I
don't be
forgot
hooping
about
like that.
that.
I don't be hooping like that. That was
Yeah,
my
I
first
know.
time touching the ball in 11 months, and I don't think I touched the ball since.
Yeah, I don't blame you. It's few and far between now. Even with the front office here, I'm like, bro, my ankle, my Achilles. That thing's ready to pop. So,
Right.
I'll keep you in mind though. If you're in the Atlanta area, you're gonna get a call.
Right. Nah, I appreciate it, man. And everybody back home, please stay tuned to what we got going on next, man. We out.